everyone, welcome to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. Today, got our final and fifth installment in the evil kids category with Mary Flora Bell, the serial killer, young 10-year-old serial killer from the UK. Before we dive into it, I just want to say a hearty hello to everyone. If this is your first time, welcome. We do true crime and weird history, as well as a little bit of pop culture commentary over here. We have a great supportive community. There's no ugliness in our comments. I try to make sure of that. So welcome. And if you are back, welcome back. Thank you so much. If you'd like to become a subscriber to the channel, please hit that red button below. Also turn on the notification bells. Like, comment, share, subscribe. It's the best way to bring new people into the community. I have a goal of trying to get to 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year, so hopefully we'll be able to do that. Again, a big shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. It's truly you that keeps this ship of true crime and weird history going, and I really appreciate it. And I just am so excited that I'm actually able just to log on to the interwebs and record it and have people listen to me. I'm glad there's a community of people that are as geeky about true crime and history and other things as I am. It's great. And yes, coming off my birthday weekend, my wife and my mother-in-law decorated my office, which was a great surprise. Even a balloon up there. See if I can get it down here. Yep. So it was great, and I appreciate everyone's patience in me taking that off. So with all that being said, if you'd like to join any of my communities, you can subscribe below. There's links to Patreon down below as well. But with that being said, let's dive into Mary Bell, shall we? Let's go. Mary Flora Bell was born May 26, 1957, in the West End district of Newcastle upon Tyne in Northumberland, UK. She was born near an area known as Rat's Alley, which we're going to talk about. She was the daughter of, at the time of her birth, unmarried woman Betty 𝗵𝗁𝗁, who was 17 years old when Mary was born. She married Billy Bell when Mary was still a very young infant. So he is credited as being her father, not that that was any great cause to celebrate, because let me tell you about Betty and Billy. Betty was a prostitute who was often gone from the childhood home where she traveled to the larger city of Glasgow to do her trade. Now, a lot of people think that when I talk about sex workers, talking about this, even talking about the UK Ripper, that I am looking down on them. I'm not. As long as it's consenting adults and a person has entered into that career out of a want to enter that career, I don't have any problem with a sex worker at all. It's when we get into areas like this, an obvious 17-year-old woman that couldn't earn work any other way and was probably doing it out of desperation, or the worst possible scenario, somebody that has been kidnapped and sold into it and trafficked into it. I have a real problem with it then. Absolutely. But so I'm not looking down on Betty because she was a prostitute. I'm looking down on Betty because of the way she raised her children, which we're going to talk about. Now, Billy, who is said to be Mary's father, we really don't know, was a habitual criminal. He was later arrested for armed robbery, and even before that, he had been a petty criminal. So not a really good nurturing situation for young Mary. Also, Betty was said to have suffered from Munchausen's by proxy syndrome, which that is a psychological ailment which the person craves attention, and so they, unlike with regular Munchausen's, they will do harm to themselves to get attention. By proxy means that they do it to another person, usually somebody that they are responsible for caring for, to get attention. And so it was believed that Betty suffered from this and used, unfortunately, Mary and Mary's siblings as a outlet for that. She would make the children sick using, lack of a better word, poisons in small amounts. She would drop them, allow them to be injured in a way to get attention for herself. And I'm sure that if we trace back Betty's beginnings, we can see probably an equally terrible childhood, which caused her to turn out the way that she did. So we're going to talk a lot about nature versus nurture. I know we've done that a lot in this series, but we're definitely going to talk about it where Mary Bell is concerned. So that was her mother, and I said her dad was, in no uncertain terms, a small-time con who was never around and certainly abusive when he was. So just imagine a young girl brought up in one of the poorest areas of Northumberland, UK. 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗏, the area that they lived, Scotswood, also known as Rat Alley, was kind of a forgotten area from the industrial age. Not a lot of work, and the work that was there was very menially paid. As a result, it was kind of a derelict area. There was a lot of construction going on, but there was also just a lot of demolition going on with nothing being built back, especially during the mid-60s when Mary would have been running around with the other children. Everyone there was fairly low income. You did have a lot of sex workers that lived there. A lot of criminals lived there because it was an area that the police had long forgotten. There wasn't it wasn't even an average amount of law enforcement that you would expect to find in a normal city or a normal neighborhood there. So it was had been abandoned to either the very poor or the very criminally inclined. And sometimes those two do overlap, because sometimes poverty is a reason that people commit crime. I'm not saying that's always the case, but you do often find in criminally ridden neighborhoods an overlap with very poor neighborhoods. That's all I'm saying there. And so in this area, the children that lived there were fairly unsupervised. I mean, this is the 60s. I mean, if you ever watched the American television show The Wonder Years, very first episode, Kevin Arnold's walking along talking about how he could go walking in his neighborhood because this was long before the time he would worry about a child ending up on a milk carton. 60s here, too. There was a great feeling that, for the most part, children were safe, so they would be allowed to play in the streets, play in these abandoned buildings, and just basically without a whole lot of adult supervision going on. And there was also kind of a village mentality that adults would look after children. And later on we're going to see that's not always the case. But just imagine, if you would, Mary Bell growing up in a situation with a neglectful and abusive mother, a neglectful and abusive father, both with tendencies to do criminal activity, because whether or not you agree with sex work or not, it's criminal activity. I don't think it should be, but it is. It is criminal activity. The same with her father's criminal activity. Seeing that, being abused, being used as a proxy for her mother's attention seeking. Growing up in an area where there was, no adult supervision, no law enforcement, and being allowed to play in hubble and rubble of abandoned buildings. So picture that. This is a bizarre, messed up Sophia. Picture Sicily, picture it. Sicily, 1929. Picture it. Rats Alley, 1960s. This is what's happening. Okay. And I also picture that Mary was most likely, because of future psychological evaluations, it was determined she was either a sociopath or a psychopath. So she was born with those tendencies not to have a conscience, not to feel empathy, and to be very apathetic. So it really was a perfect storm for what happened to happen. So Mary didn't have a whole lot of friends in the local neighborhood, in the local school, but the one that she did have was, ironically, named Bell as well, Norma Joyce Bell. She was 13 to Mary's 11 at the time that these crimes occurred, and was often seen as Mary's running about partner. They played together. They were often seen together. According to certain accounts, they had engaged in petty crimes such as shoplifting at the local shops. So just imagine these two young girls being allowed to run about kind of unsupervised. And then that brings us up to May 25th, 1968. This was actually the day before Mary's 11th birthday, when Mary lured young 4-year-old Martin Brown into one of these derelict houses. As I said, it was not uncommon for there to be construction or demolition going on in this neighborhood, and children were often allowed to play among the rubble. So it's not unusual to see children in there. No one thought anything of that, but she did lure young Martin Brown into the house, and people that saw them that day said that she was talking to Martin and convinced Martin, after examining him, whatever that meant, that he had a sore throat and she could cure it. So she was giving him a neck massage in this derelict house, and that eventually led to her tightening her hands around his throat ever tighter until she choked the life out of him. Now, when the body was found later that day, it was found by a couple of children that saw him laying there. When they realized he wasn't moving, they went and got parents and got police, and it definitely looked as though he had asphyxiated, but because Mary was still a developing child herself, there was not enough strength in her hands to make marks on the neck that one would expect to see with strangulation victims. So it remained as yet unsolved. Meanwhile, the next day, Mary and her sister in crime, Norma — now there's no evidence to link Norma to the murder of Martin Brown, I want to say that — actually broke into a local nursery, a plant nursery in Scottswood, where they vandalized it and actually left a note by Mary confessing to the strangulation of Martin Brown. The police dismissed it as a prank, though. They said there's no way anyone would take credit for the murder of a 4-year-old. So they just totally dismissed that. Again, what have I talked about in many, many videos? Shoddy police work. Also, in June, according to Norma Bell's father, he became suspicious of Mary Bell when he actually walked in on Mary with her hands around his youngest daughter's throat, saying that she had a sore throat and she was just trying to cure it. He, of course, stopped it immediately, yelled at Mary, and expelled her from their house, but did not forbid his daughter to see her anymore, which I think is totally self-defeating in that regard, but whatever. And then we fast forward to July of 1968, where teachers and other adults at the local school have become suspicious of Mary because she has been confessing in mass to other children that she was the one that killed Martin Brown. She's told her teachers that. She has written about it in the little diary that she carried around, and has even alluded to it in several writing assignments given to her by teachers. And one of her teachers did bring this to the headmasters of the school, but again, they dismissed it as the whimsical fantasy of a child. Again, this was a different time, but that's what happened. And then we come to July 31st, 1968, where Mary and Norma lured young 3-year-old Brian Howe from the area where he was playing with a bunch of other children, lured them into kind of an abandoned wasteland area there in Scottswood and Rat Alley, and did the same thing to him. Now, according to Mary, Norma did take take part in this murder, even though Norma swore to her that dying day that she did not. But that's the story we have. Mary basically choked the child to death, the same as she did with young Martin, and hid the body away under some vegetation that was in the area and left. She even kind of joined in when the other kids were asking where young Brian was. His family was asking. The police were called. Young Mary even joined the search party, trying to give them clues as to where the body was. She even slipped away during the search party, returned to the scene of the crime with some scissors, and mutilated the body, leaving the scissors in the area, and then returning to the search party to begin leading the police there. In fact, she even pointed to the very area that the body would be found, saying that she saw him there, whereas Norma was saying, no, I've never seen Brian in that area. But in any case, the police did finally search that area and found the body. They also found the scissors, which this would be intricate and what got Mary Bell arrested. They began questioning a lot of the local children, and when they questioned Mary, Mary seemed to know a whole lot more about the situation than any other child. And eventually, she mentioned that, where did they find the scissors? Just something as simple as that. And they realized that they had not released that information to the public. The public was not aware that the body had been mutilated or that scissors had been found in the area. So police knew immediately this child knew about it. And so they took her into custody and began to interrogate her. At first, she denied she had anything to do with it, but finally started to confess. But she also implicated her friend Norma, who was 13 at the time. They took Norma into custody, and Norma denied vehemently that she had anything to do with it. Meanwhile, upon reaching out to Mary's mom came in and put on what police construed as a very, very dramatic performance. Crying about her daughter's innocence, but they seemed to say it was more about bringing attention to herself than actually helping her daughter. They said the entire time the two were in a room together that even though Betty was putting on this very dramatic crying stag, that young Mary was just sitting there staring straight ahead, not acknowledging her mother at all, just kind of sitting there emotionless. And there's actually video footage of Mary that was taken during interrogation, and if I can find it, I will drop it right here for you. The trial began later that year, and in 1968, and was, of course, even though it got a lot of media, it didn't have the same media that the murder of James Bulger would have about 20 years later with the Thompson and the Venables case. If you want to know more about that, I'll link my 𝗍𝗿𝗀𝗄 episode 2, which kind of featured that crime up here. It didn't get that kind of coverage, but it was fairly well publicized. During the trial, a lot of different things came out. First, the judge had to ask, whose name was Cusack, Justice Cusack, had to ask Betty Bell to calm down, or he would remove her from the courtroom because, again, she was putting on this dramatic performance. Again, they think she suffered from Munchausen's by proxy. And also, Mary's alleged that her mother had used her as part of her services to her clients, that her mother had basically rented her out to clients, something that Betty absolutely denied, but then again, who do we believe here? But Mary contended that she had come into an interest with S&M, especially the sadist part of it early on, because of what she was subjected to at the hands of her mother and of her mother's clients, that they would use her as a pawn in whatever they were doing. Her mother also, she said, was a sadist that liked to abuse the children. There were some very well documented incidents where Mary was actually burned with cigarettes. She had pinpricks in her skin where her mother had pricked her with pins, and also there was an incident where Mary was held out the window as a young child by her mother, only to be talked in by neighbors. So Mary's defense actually alleged that Mary was psychologically damaged because her mother had literally been abusing her entire life, and that had attempted to kill her on several occasions. So she learned all this bad behavior from her mother and took it out on two innocent boys. As a result of this defense, and it was quite convincing, she was not found guilty of murder, was instead found guilty of manslaughter because of what they say was her diminished capacity, suffering from either sociopathism or psychopathism, and history of abuse, as well as her underdeveloped mental age, being only 11 at the time. She was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to be incarcerated at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is unique to the UK because it simply says you are released when they want to release you. It's not a set sentence. I don't think that would never fly here in the US, but in the UK that is a thing. So she was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. She was initially sent to Red Bank's secure unit in the 𝗬𝗎𝗄𝗎 psychiatric hospital in Lancashire, and ironically the same hospital that would later be home to John Venables 25 years later, and she was incarcerated there for the first part of her sentence starting in December of 1968. She was not a model patient, but she wasn't a hard patient to deal with. She underwent her therapies. She was also didn't really commune with the other patients. She still kind of was withdrawn and kind of into herself. And so from there, she was actually transferred from youth home to youth home, group youth home to group youth home, hospital to hospital, until she finally ended up in the mid-70s at HM Prison, Askham Grange. The withdrawn, very creepy prisoner, as relayed by guards and other prisoners, was finally released in 1980 at the age of 23. She had served 12 years of her sentence and was released and given state-granted anonymity. She was given a new name, new papers, everything, in the hopes that she would just go out and start a new life. In 1984, May 25th, 1984, she gave birth to her daughter, which both of them were additionally granted more anonymity. Anytime people realized who they were taken back into state custody, given new identities, and moved somewhere else. So Britain has gone to huge lengths to make sure that neither Mary nor her daughter were known, and the daughter did not suffer from Mary's crimes. I agree with that. What I don't agree with is Mary Bell being given total anonymity and being transferred from here to there under several aliases to make sure no one takes any sort of revenge on her. Both the Browns and the Howe family have said that they find it very disturbing that such lengths were gone to protect the person that murdered their loved one. There was an incident where someone discovered Mary Bell and her daughter in 1998, and the police were summoned to take them out so that no one ever knew. And that was when Mary Bell's daughter found out who her mother actually was. But still, swept away by the government and protected again, where the Browns and the Howes will never be the same because of the loss of their two children, and yet their perpetrators are protected. In addition, this case did not get the same kind of coverage as the murder of James Bulger got in the 90s. The families of Thompson and Venables, who were the ones that committed that crime, had to pretty much leave the area because of the call for revenge against them. That didn't happen here with Mary Bell. So I think you can see the difference in the way that Venables and Thompson were treated as a part to how Bell was treated. Bell got the plush treatment as opposed to Venables and Thompson. I mean, in 2003, Mary Bell petitioned for lifetime anonymity for both her and her daughter and any children that her daughter would have, and it was granted by England's highest court. So she's still living out there, approximate age 63, among normal people, by a different name. And I think we know how much differently that was for Venables and Thompson, not justifying anything they did or think they should have gotten better treatment. I just think it's weird how this woman, who did pretty much the same thing, got a better treatment than they are. I'm sure that has something to do with changes in British law, but according to British law now, anybody that's given lifelong anonymity to protect them from ramifications of a crime is under what they call a Mary Bell order as a result of this case. And that's just kind of where it ends. She's still alive. As I said, she's in her 60s, but we don't know who she is. She's still probably somewhere in the UK and living under another name, as is her daughter and any family that her daughter has had. And again, her daughter had nothing to do with this, but I just think that the way that this happened and then just suddenly she was gone from public record was just wild. Anyway, that's the tragic story of young serial killer Mary Bell. What are my opinions? My opinions were we literally had a psychopath. And according to my mother-in-law, who is a registered nurse and a medical researcher, and many books that I've read, says that what's portrayed on television and movies, like in Dexter, doesn't happen in reality. That most of the time, a true psychopath or a true sociopath will eventually hurt people if they are triggered. So there is really no such thing as a functional sociopath or a functional psychopath. The ones that have had a full-on exhibition of their illness. So the fact that she is out there, could go off again at any second, really concerns me. It really does. And so, but what's the solution? I mean, I don't know. I believe that, there's a stigmatism to mental health, of course, but I believe there should be a way to care for these people without allowing them to be able to walk free and possibly hurt others, without violating anyone's civil liberties. I don't know what the solution is. I'm glad I don't have to come up with the solution, but I'm just saying that we have a psychopath and a sociopath, or a sociopath who is by no means fit for society, also being brought up in an equally abusive environment, and it was just a perfect storm, which is why I think that her crime started at such an early age. Now, with Venables and Thompson, there was no evidence that their parents treated them in any way that was bad or could have led to that. I'm sure the bullying maybe they underwent at school had something to do with it, but I think in that case you had a sexually deviant psychopath or sociopath, Venables, who exerted control over Thompson, and therefore you had those crimes to commit. Those are my opinions. And I think they're just as equally dangerous as Mary Bell. And I think it's funny how differently the two cases were handled. Anyway, this concludes our series on evil kids. As I said, these are people that didn't live very long lives up until their crimes. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back to regular long-form true crime content this weekend. And until next time, Keto and Crime.